the Vatican issued its new document called Una Caro or Una Caro, which is on, well, it's a defense of marriage and a rejection of polygamy. That sounds great. There was a whole lot of sigh of relief expressed with the document because it had no overt heretical contents to it. But the document was pretty well criticized by actually the people who tend to defend Pope Leo, as well as traditional Catholics. We were practically on the same page for the most part. The document is a very long-winded approach. It says in 160 paragraphs what it could have been said in 10. And if it was 10 paragraphs, I'd read the whole thing for you verbatim. 160 is 2 hours long. I know this because I did that one time with something Pope Francis wrote, and I won't do it again. But I say overtly because one analyst has found that the language is employed in such a way that will clearly open the door for undoing Humanae Vitae and actually normalizing James Martin's parody of holy matrimony. So we'll get to this first with the more mainstream critiques on this, and then with the one person who seems to have noticed the real problem. But I want to start here to show you what kind of a person Cardinal Fernandez is, and then we don't need, no, we're not rehashing his "heal me with your mouth" stuff. Just a normal, the Vatican correspondent posted this to X. She posted this in real time at the press conference. Cardinal Fernandez just told a joke. He hesitated first. Pro tip in life: if you're going to do something and you kind of hesitate, like maybe I shouldn't do this, often enough that might be your guardian angel tapping you on the shoulder, telling you, hey, this is a bad idea. So Cardinal Fernandez just told a joke. He hesitated first about how 40 years ago they used to say that Romans had a wife, but they also had another woman and another man. He started a press conference defending holy matrimony and the church's teaching by telling an adultery joke that was a little inclusive of the James Martin types. That's how he started. Generally, I think this GIF here shows the general tenor of the reaction most Catholics had to that, because why would you do that if you were the prefect for the dicastery of the destruction of the faith? And you had a lot of these kind of reactions to this document in general. Novus Ordo Watch, yes, a set of a contest outlet. They do good reporting on news out of the Vatican. Said it's probably got some explosive premises tucked away in footnotes or half sentences somewhere that can be exploited later. Don't think for a minute these people are publishing a doctrinal statement simply to reaffirm orthodoxy. I was born at night, but not last night. So I went through the footnotes. The footnotes are make references to fiducia supplicans. They make references to Amoris Laetitia. They also make references to Leo the 13th and Pius the 10th and Pius the 12th. It might be the most broad list of sources I've seen in a Vatican document in some time that include a fair amount of preconciliar teachings, writings from the saints and things. Again, it's not overtly heretical. That's not a bad thing. So for the mainstream take on this, we'll go to the Pillar, who in the alternative media is becoming one of the better news outlets without question. The headline is Una Caro in Praise of Monogamy, a brief guide for busy readers. Here's what the 22,000 word document says. 22,000 words to just give you what could have even been an elevator speech. I'll give you an example. The document has just paragraphs of this Pope said this, followed by this Pope who said this, and then this Pope said this, and then the Vatican II, post-Vatican II popes said this, starting with Paul VI, and then John the 20th, and all, da-da-da. They could have turned those into 3 paragraphs, saying, before the Second Vatican Council, the magisterium of the Church affirmed state teaching. Footnote, with Leo the 13th and his documents, Pius the 10th and his documents, yada, yada, yada. And then another paragraph like it for the post-conciliar popes. And then if you want to give a little more space to Francis, because that's what they love to do now, you could have quoted him more directly, but you would have just cut out like 10 pages of the document. I'm not exaggerating. This thing is enormous. On Tuesday, the Vatican's doctrinal office released a 22,000 word document that could arguably be summed up in just 3 words: Monogamy is good. The Italian text Una caro elogio de monogamia, one flesh, in praise of monogamy, was presented November 25th by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. The DDF has announced no specific release date for the English edition, but official translation will likely appear in the coming days or weeks. Probably weeks. So a bit of news I'll show you in a minute. The Vatican has officially declared that Latin is no longer the base language of the Catholic Church. That's a big deal. All documents were issued first in Latin, an unchanging language. And then every edition in English, Italian, Swahili, whatever, was based on the Latin. No longer. That is a big deal. And it is another step that shows a new religion. Latin is one of the 4 languages that were placed on the cross with our Lord, or 3 languages, sanctified. That is why we make a big deal out of the Latin language, not because it's pretty. Anyway, the note is inspired not only by Western social changes, but also by a debate among bishops in Africa and on other continents about how the church should respond to the pastoral challenge of polygamy. The Bishops' Conference of Africa and Madagascar is currently preparing a report for the Synod of Bishops on the topic. In a November update, the Bishops of Africa and Madagascar President Cardinal Fridolin Mbongo said the DDF had offered encouraging feedback on a draft text and highlighted specific considerations to be addressed. This is in reference to something actually that they'd been saying for the last year or two, which is the Bishops of Africa and Madagascar, as a conference, have said that the church's teaching on holy matrimony doesn't work for Africa because a man having multiple wives is a pretty normal thing there. I'm glad that they didn't overtly give an inch on this. Overtly. The close cooperation between the doctrinal dicastery and African bishops is notable given recent ecclesiastical history. It goes on to tell you about how the African bishops famously rejected fiducia supplicans. Cardinal Fernandez, says the document has a positive purpose of drawing from the Holy Scriptures, from the history of Christian thought, from philosophy, and even from poetry, reasons and motivations that encourage people to choose a unique and exclusive union of love. He hopes the diverse sources will form a beautiful mosaic that enriches readers' understanding of monogamy. Skip to the last chapter and the conclusion. They say if you're in a hurry. Then it goes over, it's like an outline here. I'll have this linked in the show notes at the Return to Tradition Substack if you're interested. There's one red flag in there. I have said this many times, and I've never gotten a good answer for this. Maybe you'll be the person who can answer this for me. Why is it that the Catholic Church is the only religion on the planet that cares one iota about what other practitioners and leaders of other religions think about ours? No one else seems to care about what Catholics think about their religion. Why do we care about what others think of ours? And I say that because this document actually includes some examples from like Eastern pagan religions about how they treat the question. That's nice, I guess. If you want to write an ecumenical document on ecumenical understandings of holy matrimony, how other religions view it, it might be an interesting exercise in anthropology. But what's it have to do with answering the question of how the Catholic Church should address how Catholics should live? I'll never get a good answer for this, I don't think. Now, for those who are looking for maybe a little more concrete answer on the question on what the Vatican's doing on this, from the Pillar, also on the same day, headline, DDF head, no plans to change canon law on polygamous unions. That's unequivocally a good thing. The African bishops have long expressed concerns about the canonical discipline. The Vatican's chief doctrinal official, that would be Fernandez, said Tuesday that there are no plans to change canon law for addressing the situations of polygamous men entering the Catholic Church. Cardinal Fernandez told the Pillar that there remain unresolved questions about the pastoral challenges of polygamy in sub-Saharan Africa. They're not going to change canon law. They have no plan to, anyway. Saying you have no plan to do something does kind of leave the door open to all of a sudden having a plan to do something. Look at a couple responses to this. First, from a traditional voice, Mr. Murray Rundis, who is these days over at Pelican Plus, posted his thought to X. Said, like the other documents earlier this week, I covered one of them. I don't think the other document's actually good, but there are some gems here, like from St. Alphonsus or in the magisterial intervention section, where he's talking there about the unnecessarily long quotes and things from popes and saints and things. But my big initial concern is that this document doesn't achieve its ends. It is full of self indulgent, superfluous, poetic, modern, and non Catholic reflections on marriage. How are the African seminaries supposed to use this document to raise up good priests, prepared to educate and pastor to the polygamists when much of the document is flowery language and modern overcomplications? I would rather have the DDF simply compile and reprint St. Alphonsus. That would be better because it won't have any of the hidden traps in it that this document has, according to one observer. Mr. Fernandez continued his thought, saying the DDF really should not be a self-indulgent game show where theologians play a roulette wheel to make sure their perspective is articulated in an endless vomit of text. These documents need to be used for pastoral benefit. Again, there are some good moments here, but I don't think that we get to the point of being pastorally useful. He's not wrong. The document is 160 paragraphs long and is full of ambiguous language. Some of it not overtly obvious. Now, here's a more moderate voice. Mr. Christian Wagner, you may be familiar with him. He is a Catholic content creator, tends to be called a popesplainer by some. I don't know if that's fair to him or not, but he's definitely not generally on the same page as people like myself when it comes to Leo and Francis. But you wouldn't know it from this statement. Just finish Una Caro and have some thoughts. One, the structure of the document completely ruins it from any sort of practical use. The stated purpose of the document is both to provide some resources to oppose polygamy and for those seeking marriage. The form of the document is completely detached from it being useful for either of these purposes, bloated, rambling, and not providing any sort of clear, succinct synthesis. Two, the explanation of how the good of the spouses can be primary in marriage was good insofar as such good is understood as the integral good, which includes and is exemplified by the growth in spiritual life. I will pause here and say this is one of my problems with the document. Prior to Vatican II, and you saw this first happen in Humanae Vitae, but prior to Vatican II, you had marriage being described as its first purpose as the begetting and education of children. And then it was the mutual good of the spouses. Humanae Vitae flipped that. The mutual good of the spouses came first, and then the begetting of children. Some people don't think that's a big deal. It is a big deal. When you change the primary end, where you say the first end of something and then the second end of something, and you flip the order of those things, it changes the priority. And here, so it's reaffirming Humanae Vitae on that. If you don't believe me, go read Casti Connubii by Pius XI. I have it on this channel. It's one of the very few papal encyclicals I've ever recorded that YouTube really didn't like. By the way, they punished me for it. Go figure. Says 3, the explanation of the primacy of unity as basically flowing from the primacy of the common good that transcends the good of the persons who make up the marital society was quite awesome. In more plain language, Mr. Wagner really liked the section in the document where Cardinal Fernandez talked about the social benefits of marriage. Primacy of unity is basically flowing from the primacy of the common good. This is where you link Catholic social teaching. You get a stable society out of one that values marriage, which is more important than the goods of the individual persons, because it's part of that. You start getting to like questions of the collective of society. Mentioning the anti-adultery laws while quoting Pius XI, quoting St. Alphonsus on the ends of marriage, robust treatments against concupiscence. All these things were good, other than the fact they came from a man who literally was helping people be more subject to concupiscence and things in his own writings that he's been shredded for before. People ask him if this is a sufficient source to be used against polygamy. All the arguments provided necessary, he says, but it's just that doesn't do the job because the document is badly written. Another moderate voice before we go into the critique. I've been hinting at this critique, but here's the final moderate voice. What unitate fide amounts to is clear definitions of the faith and condemnation of heresy. We're all very good in their day, but we prefer to continue on the path of pursuing unity where there is none to be had and downplaying our divine mandate in order to achieve it. And that is a moderate take I've seen on this consistently. And it's true if you read the document. It really does downplay the supernatural aspect of marriage. That cannot be understated. We've seen this before. One of the errors of the modernists is keeping God almost to being, he's not a deist in their view. The deist God is, the divine architect and watchmaker, Thomas Jefferson's watchmaker, a God who got the ball rolling and then went to watch football for all of eternity afterwards. Wasn't really paying attention to what humans were doing, right? That's kind of their view of things. The modernists don't take that view, but they do keep him more distant than the Catholic Church has ever kept him, and that any kind of vaguely Orthodox Christianity has ever taken God to be. And that is clear in this document. Now, the negative critique. I've only seen one. Why is that? Those are Mr. Chris Jackson. Heretical in Exile over on Substack. Yes, I'll have a link to this in the show notes today at the Anthony Stine Substack. Una Caro, Leo's marriage letter is a door to contraception and James Martin pairings. His one flesh meditation looks pious on the surface. Underneath it hands the contraception and James Martin revolution, the very tools it needs. Talks about how it's supposed to be about conjugal charity, and it looks like it's very pious, but it's not. Here's where it gets to be important. Once you watch the way the text quotes Caro Wojtyla, recasts openness to life, it becomes clear what is going on. Una Caro is not a frontal attack on Catholic teaching. It's the Trojan horse parked just inside the gates, still wrapped in Wojtyla's vocabulary, but packed with the logic that the Academy's moral engineers will need to justify artificial contraception and eventually sterile unions of every kind. And it arrives in the same season that Leo has crowned Renzo Pergararo as president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, the very man who helped turn that body from a bulwark for the unborn into a post-Christian bioethics think tank. This happened, and almost no media outlet talked about it. Good luck finding articles on this. There's a couple out there. But Pope Leo made someone who was opposed to the very work John Paul II was doing, and what the church had always been doing, on the question of life. And he flipped it, and Pope Leo put him in charge, kept him in charge. You do not need much imagination to see where this is meant to go. Instead of a wall protecting marriage, this letter is a cleverly designed door. What did the church always say? Mr. Jackson gives it to us. He says, the older magisterium treated marriage in supernatural terms. Trent spoke of the sacrament instituted by Christ as a remedy for concupiscence and as an office ordered to the procreation and education of children. Leo XIII, in Arcanum and other documents, stressed the indissoluble bond, and the family as a society small in number, but no less a true society than the state itself. Pius XI's Casti Connubii spoke plainly. God attached to the marital act a primary end, the procreation and education of offspring, and a secondary end, mutual help and remedy for concupiscence. I'll pause here. If you read Humanae Vitae, Paul VI flipped this. He made the primary end the mutual help and remedy for concupiscence, and the secondary end the procreation and education of offspring, when the church taught the opposite, put the order in the other direction. And this is where you get a lot of modern problems on the teaching of marriage, where it's lived out by Catholics, where you get some people using NFP as a form of birth control. I have known plenty of Catholic women, Catholic married couples, who would use NFP for to increase their chances of having a child. And I've also known Catholics who used it to prevent having children, and not for just short term because of health reasons or financial reasons or anything else that a priest, a good traditional priest, might in conversation have with them and determine was fine use for it. I'm not endorsing that use for it, but through spiritual direction, they may have gotten some good help on that. I've known some who did that and ended up leaving the church multiple times. Don't ever underestimate what happens when you break these two ends from one another and after you reverse them. When this becomes the primary reason, you are running into a minefield. I've known many young Catholics who got married, focused on this part, and ended up leaving the church. And they were good Catholics, way holier than I ever was. Shocked me when I saw that they had left the church, until I thought about it for a little bit, from the things I knew about them in real life. Anyway, In that tradition, love is not a free-floating feeling that creates its own meaning. Love is ordered by nature and grace. Conjugal charity embraces children because it is rooted in the Creator's design, the teaching of the Church on such matters. Unacero inherits the vocabulary but not the backbone. It speaks warmly about conjugal charity and responsible fruitfulness, but it consistently treats procreation as one aspect among many, a symbol folded into a broader narrative of self realization, emotional support, and accompaniment. The decisive shift shows itself in paragraph 145. I was not lying when I said this thing was long. The section Leo's ghostwriters hang on Carol Wotia in order to push the boundaries without seeming to. The Wotia, John Paul II quote that will be used to blow up Humanae Vitae. Here's the heart of the matter. The letter states, quote, and they're quoting John Paul II with this. The sexual union as a way of expressing conjugal charity must naturally remain open to the communication of life, even if this does not mean that this must be an explicit aim of every such act. In fact, three legitimate situations can arise. Mr. Jackson then says it then lists first the case of a couple who cannot have children, and second, quote, that a couple does not consciously seek a certain act as a means of procreation. Wotia is then quoted, quote, a conjugal act, which being in itself an act of love that unites two persons, may not necessarily be considered by them as a conscious and desired means of procreation. Meaning, and this is you'll find this in church history, every time a man and his wife come together in this way, it does not have to be explicitly for procreation. They just have to be open to it. That's it. It's not that hard. Mr. Jackson says, read quickly. The paragraph can sound orthodox. The church has always recognized infertile marriages as true marriages, and she has never demanded that spouses crank up an explicit baby intention in their imagination before every embrace. But Una Caro is not simply reminding us of that. The line, sexual union must naturally remain open to the communication of life, even if this does not mean that this must be an explicit aim of every such act, already shifts the center of gravity. It says, in effect, the general story of the couple's openness to life suffices, even if particular acts are not lived here and now in that procreative horizon. The problem is not merely the framework around that sentence. The sentence itself is being used to introduce a new standard. Instead of asking whether this concrete act respects the procreative structures willed by God, Una Caro invites us to ask whether the couple's relationship, taken as a whole, can still be described as open to life, even when individual acts are closed off in practice. Then it canonizes this shift by listing it as one of three legitimate situations. Even the clause about not consciously seeking procreation at every act becomes toxic in this setting. In Wotia's original context, it could be read as a simple reminder that spouses are not obliged to manufacture an explicit procreative intention before every embrace. In Una Caro, that same phrase is torn from its context and repurposed. It is slotted in as one of the legitimate situations precisely to suggest that the procreative meaning of the act may recede into the background, so long as the couple's interior narrative of conjugal charity remains intact. In other words, they could have an interior disposition that's fine, but it's built on the foundation that is built on sand. That they have a complete misunderstanding of church teaching on this, and then act according to that misunderstanding. This is why the modernist infiltration of the church is so diabolical. They will employ Catholic language, employ Catholic reasoning to achieve their own ends when they distort those teachings. He goes down on this path saying, notice the pattern. First, quote, the sexual union as a way of expressing conjugal charity must naturally remain open to the communication of life. The act is defined primarily as an expression of charity, not as a kind of act with a fixed, God-given structure ordered toward generation. Openness to life is lowered one level down, treated as a general background condition. Then, quote, even if this does not mean that this must be an explicit aim of every such act. In fact, three legitimate situations can arise. The category of legitimate situations is now built around a psychological description of intention, not around the objective moral species of acts. Activities, in other words, are objectively good or evil. By the time the text quotes John Paul II, quote, a conjugal act being in itself an act of love that unites two persons may not necessarily be considered by them as a conscious and desired means of procreation. The stage is set. Here is the move in plain language. The old question was whether this act in itself respects the procreative structure of the marital act. or whether the spouses are deliberately sterilizing it. The new question becomes whether the act is an expression of conjugal love within a marriage that is, in some broad way, open to life, even when this particular act is intentionally closed to life by contraception, withdrawal, or other means. Once you transfer the center of gravity from the act's God given nature to the couple's interior narrative, Humanae Vitae becomes a dead letter. The condemnation of contraception in that encyclical depends on the fact that the marital act has a given structure that man may not deliberately frustrate. Leo's text keeps the old vocabulary of openness while preparing to hollow out its content. That is exactly what the dissident moralists around the Pontifical Academy for Life have been calling for. And now the Botia passage is waiting in Una Caro, ready to be cited as the magisterial bridge that lets them cross. We saw this already in Morris Laetitia state the teaching on marriage and then give pastoral advice or direction that directly contradicts the pastoral teaching. Same with Fiducia Supplicans, much more brazenly. And Mr. Jackson goes on to talk about Archbishop Lefebvre's open letter to confused Catholics and how he saw this coming. I recommend you go read that book if you're interested. The SSPX have a full reading of it on their YouTube channel. I have a full reading of it on my YouTube channel. It's worth your time because he wrote this to French Catholics in like the 1980s. And it sounds like he could have been writing it to anybody in the Western world in the 21st century. It hasn't changed much in those years. Now, this comes on top of this news here. As you probably know, the Vatican has an official language. The Catholic Church has an official language, and it's Latin. It has been that way since antiquity, because Latin is a language that is not changing. New words are added to the vocabulary by Latinists who work for the Vatican in their official capacity to help address new concepts as needed. But as a general thing, the Latin language doesn't change. And the Latin language, by not changing, means that when it's used, it has to be used very intentionally. It has to be used in a way that's not open to playing around fast and loose with it. Hence, one of the great advantages of the traditional Mass being in Latin is you cannot have your priest ad-libbing the Mass, like they do even in some reverent and pious Novus Ordo Masses, where the priest will still ad-lib things because he can ad-lib them. Latin does not allow for that. That's why this is a big story. Here we are going to the Catholic Herald. Headline: Vatican ends routine use of Latin and sweeping overhaul of Curia governance. This is a big deal. Una Cora, as well as the other documents that came out of Rome in the last week, were written in Italian, not Latin. There are no English translations of the documents yet. They will come. And one thing to keep in mind here is we have caught them before issuing document that was first in Italian, and then the other languages versions would come out, and there were certain passages that would be translated completely differently, where different words would be placed in that changed the meaning of something, thus adding to the ambiguity of the situation. With Latin, it's a lot harder to get away with that. The Vatican has announced the most far-reaching overhaul of its internal administration in a quarter of a century, with Pope Leo XIV approving two major regulatory texts that will reshape daily life inside the Holy See. Signed on the Feast of Christ the King and published on the 24th of November, the new regulation of the Roman Curia and the corresponding regulation of personnel set out a 5-year ad experimentum framework intended to bring order, consistency, and modern management to an institution long governed as much by custom as by law. Among the most striking changes is the disappearance of the old requirement that curial acts be drafted as a rule in Latin. Vatican officials privately acknowledge that with Italian, English, French, and other modern languages now permitted for normal use, this will in practice mean the abandonment of Latin. Article 50 states that while, quote, the curial institutions will normally draft their acts in Latin or in another language, care will be taken to ensure that major documents intended for publication are translated into the most widely used languages. Under the reforms, all acts intended for the Pope must be channeled through the Secretariat of State, and documents of broader significance must be shared across relevant institutions before publication.
Interdicasterial meetings are now governed by mandatory procedures and scheduled collaboration. Officials interpret these moves as an attempt to restore coherence and accountability after years of overlapping jurisdictions and divergent administrative practices. Another innovation directly concerns the church's faithful. For the first time, regulations stipulate that dicasteries must examine and, if necessary, adjudicate on matters of the faithful, exercising their right directly refer to the Holy See. In such cases, the local ordinary and the pontifical representative are to be consulted confidentially. In practical terms, this grants Catholics a right not to be ignored by Vatican departments, places a significant burden on officials who until now could decline to respond to sensitive or complex matters such as the traditional Latin Mass. It goes into digitalization and all sorts of other office reforms. But the Vatican is no longer operating with Latin as its base language. In terms of the publication of writings, I don't know if Francis ever issued a document in Latin first. This has been the practice for some time. Now, in another weird turn at this, Cardinal Fernandez at the press conference for Una Caro, for those of you wondering what's going on, why are they continuing to release documents that were started by Francis? The custom is when a pope dies, so do all of his projects that have not been completed. They go with him. A pope might choose to do one thing, to keep one thing going, but usually they don't. Cardinal Fernandez let the game slip at the press conference. He said that he's still working on another 2 or 3 documents that were started under Francis, authorized under Francis, and that they will be published. And then he will meet with Pope Leo to chart the course afterwards. Make no mistake, that was Pope Leo's doing. He could have said no when he first met with Fernandez in May after he became Pope. He made the conscious choice to continue his predecessor's work and not just paying lip service to, oh, we're going to continue the reforms started by Francis and we're going to continue synodality, not just paying lip service to it, but demonstrably he's continued it in every single way. Excuse me, still have my cold. But here he gave the game away. He's meeting with the Pope to chart the course forward after these documents are issued, which will be sometime next year. March, probably, if I had to guess. He is purposely continuing the program of Francis. He didn't tell us what those documents were, so we will find out together what they are. Now, on another note, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops used to say that the primary issue facing the church in the United States, the church in the West in general, was the sacrifice of the most vulnerable to Moloch. Certain medical procedures done for the most young in the womb or the elderly to send them off to their judgment prematurely, we'll say, for convenience. Our hosts don't like it when we talk about certain issues, but they are because they're fairly hot button and extremely divisive, and they have their own political slant, and they unabashedly will use it to suppress voices who go against the grain. Be that as it may, the Vatican used to rightly say that that was the preeminent issue, because if you are ignoring the gospel and the lack of it being spread, that was a preeminent issue. The actual preeminent issue in America and the West is that the gospel is not being spread. Every issue that the church cares about is downstream from the gospel not being spread. But, if we're ignoring that, then that sacrifice to Moloch is the preeminent issue. That was how it is. We go here to another mainstream news outlet that is by no means a rad trad outlet. That's the wrong one. We go here to the Catholic Herald once again for this headline. The president of the USCCB, who is Archbishop Coakley of Oklahoma City, identifies immigration as a burning issue. This should surprise no one. This is now your topic du jour, and the bishops have shown us this by their behavior for the last year. Ever since it was announced that the government was going to cut off funds to certain organizations it's a nonprofit issue organizations in general, and the U.S. government found that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, through its various charity organizations and with contracting with other charity organizations who got their contracts from the government, were raking in billions of dollars from this. And the bishops, of course, have denied that they've never made a profit from this. Oh, it cost us so much money. But they always said it in a way that was very carefully worded. They never made money off their U.S. government contracts. Probably true. But if you factor in the contracts from other nonprofits, that's a little different at that point. They've got billions. And ever since then, the bishops have been with one voice, including bishops that you would think would know better. Some of the very conservative bishops in parts of the U.S. that are very, very traditionally minded on other issues, all with one voice saying, hey, this is now the preeminent issue. Some of us warned that this was going to happen. Archbishop Paul Coakley has stressed that the plight of migrants remains at the heart of the American bishop's agenda in a wide-ranging interview. In an interview with Vatican News following his election as president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, he identified immigration as a burning issue for the church in the U.S. He recalled that the country is a nation built on migration experience, and insisted the bishops must accompany and support immigrant communities as they face fear and uncertainty. He added that advocacy must match pastoral care. The church must advocate for the good of the nation, he said, ensuring that legal structures permit migrants, including religious workers, to enter and remain with their families. At the same time, he affirmed the need to protect borders and ensure that immigration is carried out in an orderly fashion. Asked how the episcopate might help heal national divisions, Coakley drew on the concept of communion. Using a phrase previously employed by Pope Francis, he said the bishops aim to be agents and instruments of communion that will set an example in our society to help stand against the tendency towards increased polarization. He acknowledged that disagreement is inevitable. Disagreement will always be a part of human relations and relations in the church and within the College of Bishops, he said, but added that what matters is that we disagree with reverence and respect and listen to one another. I think that's very much a part of the whole focus on synodality. By the way, Coakley is widely considered one of the more conservative bishops in the United States. By the way. On synodality, the Archbishop said the U.S. Church is already committed to consultation, but must move deeper into listening and dialogue. His simplest description of synodality was that it is, quote, walking together, which he expanded by saying, so that's learning to listen, being willing to engage in dialogue, and learning to cooperate with one another. That sounds almost too simple, but I think that's the heart of what synodality means. He stressed that the church is not the bishop's church, it's not the pastor's church, it's our church. Members of the baptized living in communion with one another and with those entrusted with leadership. Actually, your evidence, it's Christ's church, not your church, it's not my church, it's not ours as a collective. It is the church of Jesus Christ, founded on the rock of Peter. And living in communion with one another and listening and all that, yeah, that's important. But listening to the Holy Spirit promptings is actually more important, is the most important thing. Anyway, he says, through that lens, he said priests and bishops need to lead the way and show the way, but the participation of all the faithful is fundamental. In practice, Coakley said this means the U.S. bishops are placing immigrant pastoral work at the center of their priorities. They're calling for calmer public rhetoric, for legal reform to facilitate family unity, and for ensuring that migrants do not live in fear or insecurity. Archbishop Coakley and others have also recently called for the U.S. government to essentially stop its crackdowns entirely and start offering a path to citizenship for pretty much everybody here. That's the Democratic Party's platform. It's not lost on those of us paying attention that that's what they're doing. The bishop's agenda will continue to emphasize accompaniment of the vulnerable, while also seeking to model communion and respect in a highly polarized society. Meanwhile, the topic of Eucharistic discipline remains active in the U.S. The U.S. bishops has long debated whether Catholic politicians who support the sacrifice to Moloch should be denied Holy Communion. At a 2021 meeting, the bishops approved drafting a document on the Eucharist that could have implications for high-profile Catholic public figures. One Vatican prelate reiterated that the decision rests with the individual diocesan bishops. And it goes on, and all that stuff. Even touches on women deacons. That's the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for you. Taking this issue to its logical conclusion. Some of us predicted that this is where they were going to go. But this is now their preeminent issue. And it, at the very least, has piles and piles and piles of money behind it. Are you surprised by any of this? You know, he talked about Eucharistic reverence. I'm going to show you something here that utterly blew my mind. Viewer of this podcast or listener of this podcast, whatever platform you all watch or listen on, sent me something from Instagram of all places. This is, as they tell me, a Roblox mass in Peru. Excuse me again, and specifically Chiclayo. For those aren't aware of where Chiclayo is, that is the diocese that one Archbishop Robert Prevost, Cardinal Robert Prevost, aka Pope Leo XIV, is from. If you don't know what Roblox is, you've heard of Minecraft, right? Video game that a lot of Gen Z types really like. Weirdly, because it's like a 3D 8-bit graphic game. You're doing a lot of building and mining and other things they make some pretty impressive things. Excuse me again. I have seen cathedrals built in Minecraft and videos online. Interesting stuff. Well, now here you have a diocesan mass in Roblox. This is a denigration of the mass itself. This is not the same thing as a Hollywood movie depicting a mass being offered in a film for story purposes, and the mass is offered with some respect, or at least an attempt at accuracy. You know, it looks like they try in a movie to make the mass look accurate to the way a mass is offered. When they kind of mess up a little bit, people tend to be a little forgiving because you can tell they tried. This is something different. This is a mass presented by a bishop or a diocese in a video game, presented as something good. Apologies again. It's not good by any stretch of the imagination. You see some people laughing at it in the comments. Of course they are. I'm curious, though, what you think of all this. So let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot, too. As always, pray for the church and everybody who spoke about negatively today. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.